Okay, I think we might kick things off. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joe from MediKane. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at our webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First of all, Dr. Malcolm Ball, MediKane's Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder. How are you today, Malcolm?
Very well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
And I'm also delighted to welcome Patricia Reed, an experienced health practitioner. How are you today, Patricia?
I'm well, thanks, Joe. Great to be here.
Wonderful. So today's format, I'll shortly be handing over to Malcolm, who's going to give us a 10 to 15 minute presentation on the importance of gut health and the impact that it can play specifically with mental health and diabetes management. We'll then have a facilitated Q&A session, and thank you to everyone who's sent in a question in advance. If you have a question for Patricia and Malcolm, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom within the Zoom webinar feature and send your questions through as soon as you've got them, and we'll get through as many of those at the end. The session today is going to be recorded, so if you want to revisit it or miss any of it, then we'll be sending that on to you after the event. So before I hand over to Malcolm, just going to share my screen and talk a little bit about why we're here today. So this week is National Diabetes Week in Australia, and the focus this year is on mental health and specifically the stigma that people living with diabetes go through on a daily basis. MediKane are really pleased to be contributing and participating in this week and doing our bit to help raise awareness of what it's like for people living with diabetes. There are lots of great resources on the Heads Up Diabetes Australia campaign website, and the URL is there on the bottom. Okay, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Malcolm Ball. Over to you, Malcolm.
Great, thanks, Joe. So I want to very quickly run through the basics and the science behind the idea of gut health and mental health and the balance between the two. This is going to be quite a quick introduction. Obviously, this is a huge field with lots of intricacies. So I'm going to run through the basics quite quickly, but then if you have anything specific that you'd like us to go into more depth later on, that's where the questions and answers, and we can get to it there. Thanks, Joe. So the most important part about this is not a theory anymore. There is an enormous amount of evidence that what happens in our gut affects our brains, and even vice versa. We're still working out the details, so we can't nail down specific neurotransmitters or specific bacteria, but whether or not this actually happens is not a question anymore. The main concept that encompasses all of this is the gut-brain axis. So the gut-brain axis is the fact that the nervous system that's in our gut, called the enteric nervous system, and the nervous system in our brain, our central nervous system, or what we think of as nerves, are actually two distinct entities that communicate with each other. And what happens in the gut translates into nervous energy, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Another thing that's been shown to be absolutely true now is that your blood sugar levels affect your mood. Like, everybody's had that idea of, oh, my blood sugar is going low and I'm feeling anxious and those kind of things. But also high blood sugar levels affect your mental state as well. So your blood sugar levels are affected by your gut. So there's now two different mechanisms that act in concert to have this effect. And one of the messages I really want to try and get across here is that human beings are exceptionally good at working out when something is wrong, but terrible at telling what that is. So a lot of our physical discomforts translate into mental anxiety and even feelings of depression and things like that. So depression can almost be considered to be chronic pressure caused by our physical state, or at least that's part of it. Obviously, there are other factors involved, but a big part of it is we're no good at telling the difference between is it something wrong with my biochemistry, or is it something wrong with my environment and how I'm interacting with that environment? Thanks, Joe. I want to be clear here specifically that this is not an us or them kind of situation. It's the gut, controlling the gut and how we help mental state through gut balancing is not the enemy of pharmaceuticals. The two actually work together. There are different things that solve different problems. Pharmaceuticals, I should say that I started off in the more traditional pharmaceutical space, so I'm definitely not anti-pharmaceuticals, and nobody here is. But pharmaceuticals solve a specific problem, and it's not the same problem that medical nutrition solves, and the two work together. So this picture is an example. The metaphor I like to use is that our biochemistry is a symphony. And there's two ways that the music can be off. Either an instrument can be broken and needs to be repaired. And that's what a pharmaceutical does. It takes a broken instrument and it fixes it. But if all of the instruments are a little bit out of tune, the music is still awful. And no, forcing one instrument to get better will not solve that problem. What you need to do is retune the entire orchestra. And that's what medical nutrition does. And further to that, pharmaceuticals don't work in isolation. They need the rest of the biochemistry of the body to function as effectively as they possibly can. So the two work together, they solve different problems, and together you can fix the situation. Sometimes you need a pharmaceutical, sometimes you need a medical nutrition, sometimes you need both. Thanks, Joe. So what does medical nutrition do? In its simplest terms, what we're doing is restocking the pantry. So everything that happens in our body, we get effectively from our food, apart from oxygen and sunlight. And we have a tendency to think of these things as being unlimited resources or completely recycled, but that's not actually the case. Most of the things that we use in our body are in limited pools. An example of that a lot of people have heard is there's no point in taking vitamins because your body can't store them, and so you just weed them out. And that's a very extreme example, but the point is you still need to get those vitamins all the time to replenish those resources. As your resources become scarce, your body will start to restrict what they use them for. So if you've got a pool of neurotransmitters, for example, that does not meet every need for your body will start to restrict what those neurotransmitters are used for. And the gut has a very high priority, and I'll get to that a little bit more in a second. Essential nutrients. So what an essential nutrient is it's something that we can't make ourselves. It's something that we have to get from our diet. So a lot of people have heard of essential amino acids, but a lot of the vitamins and minerals are essential as well. We must get them from our diet. And they play key roles in our mental health and our mental acuity. So if they're not there, you just can't work properly. It's that simple. There's no ifs or buts about it. If you are deficient in these essential nutrients, your brain or any of your biochemistry is not going to work as well as it should. And the last point I just wanted to make here is that we are exceptionally good at surviving. A colleague of mine once said that if we weren't so good at surviving, everybody would be a lot healthier. And so things that would normally kill another animal, we can live with quite happily because we are very good at adapting to non-ideal situations. And our body will always choose survival over the optimal function of any one thing. So if I need to eat to live, then my body will prioritize eating to live. I don't need to be happy to live. It's a benefit, but I don't need it. So your body will prioritize eating to live over being happy. Again, it really is that simple. Thanks, Joe. And this brings us into the concept of hierarchies of need. And what that means is exactly what I said. There's these incredibly complex allocations of resources happening in real time every day. Every minute of every day, not just every day. And those resources will constantly be reallocated based on what your body thinks it needs to survive. And that changes based on your diet and what other aspects. So even things like I've been attacked is a good example. The fight or flight response. That's a very extreme example of resource allocation. When that fight or flight instinct hits in an instant, adrenaline's pumped into your system, blood glucose flushes into your blood to give your muscles power, and everything gets realigned to that. But that happens all the time, just every day. And a big part of that affects our mental health. To go into the gut-brain axis a little bit more, a very large part of our neurotransmitters and our nervous system in its entirety is about running our gut. It's estimated to be between sort of 70 and 80%. And so even though we think of ourselves as a brain, what we really are is a gut with something that runs it in terms of our biochemistry. And so these neurotransmitters are used to make the muscles in our gut digest our food. And as I said, if we have a digestion issue, then we will prioritize the digestion. So the gut is priority number one. The other reason why we want to play with it, though, is and want to manage it, I should say, is because the microbiome can be changed very quickly. The microbiome literally changes every day. So the microbiome that I have today is not the microbiome I had yesterday. So this is a way that we can manage things in real time in a very effective way. And the last point on this I just want to make is it's not a passive system. If we have bad bacteria in our gut, they actually hijack the system to make us worse. And so this is where to make us eat foods that are good for them and not necessarily good for us. This has actually been shown with sugar. So the sugar consuming bacteria in our gut will release serotonin when they get sugar. So this is possibly where the idea of a comfort food comes from. These high-fat, high-sugar foods. What happens is we eat them, they feed our gut. They don't feed us, but they feed these bacteria in our gut, and the bacteria in the gut make us feel better about it. So this kind of active interaction happens all the time, and we need to manage it in that way. Yeah, thanks. So this slide I've brought up just because I want to show just how complex the system is. This is every known pathway as of 2010. And you can see it's incredibly complicated. And this goes back to the symphony that I was talking about. What I want you to get out of this image is just how many arrows go all over the place. So this map is actually laid out in a roughly interactional fashion as well. So the idea is that any one thing here interacts a whole range of other things. It's not just an isolated thing. Now, when you use a pharmaceutical, you will push on one or two of those arrows. So you're going to have hopefully, and they're designed this way, let's be clear. We don't want them to do anything other than the one thing that we try and design them to, because that's what we call side effects or adverse events. So a pharmaceutical will be very narrow, but medical nutrition, we don't need to know which one of those arrows are out of alignment to be able to fix them. What we need to do is provide the resource pool that the body then self-corrects. This also has the added advantage of we can't overdose. So if you're using medical nutrition, you won't force the body to do something it doesn't want to do. If the pool is already sufficient, then the worst case is nothing happens. So side effects are very, very rare. The last thing I want you to get out of this is, if you look in the very center of that diagram, that big circle right in the middle, that's the Krebs cycle. That's our body using blood glucose or making glucose to go into our blood and using it as energy. And as I said, this map is roughly relational, and that it's not a mistake that blood glucose cycle is right in the middle. it's because it interacts with absolutely everything in our bodies. And that's why we need to try and maintain it as best as we can. Thanks, Joe. So just in summary then, almost all of our biochemistry starts with digestion. We get everything we need from our foods, or we don't get everything we need from our foods, and that's why we've got to play an active role in helping our biochemistry get along. The enteric nervous system is often called the second brain because it has so much of our nerves and uses so much of our neurotransmitters. It not only uses about 80% of our neurotransmitters, it actually produces about 90% of them. And a lot of those are produced by the bacteria in the gut. So again, if you're not feeding the bacteria in the gut the right way, you're not getting the neurotransmitters you need. It really is just that simple. It's like trying to paint a wall with half a bucket of paint when what you need is 3 buckets. If you're not feeding the system that gives you the paint, you can't paint the wall. It really is that straightforward. The gut-brain axis has 3 main factors, the way that it affects our mental state. So we've talked about the neurotransmitters. We've talked about the direct interaction between the nerves. So if something's not happening right in the gut, that will send a signal to the brain that the brain reads as anxiety or nervous energy. But also, the majority of the immune system is linked to the gut as well. And so inflammation plays a large role in our mental state, we're starting to understand. So if you've got a intestinal system that is largely inflamed, that causes the immune system to flare up. That can cause all sorts of things like allergies and things like that, but it also reads as anxiety and nervousness and depression when that inflammation starts to affect our central nervous system, not just our enteric nervous system. The feedback loops are very sophisticated and very quick. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of these things happen every minute, and they constantly readjusting. So it is the real core message I want to get across here is it is something that can be adjusted. The microbiome definitely affects our sugar levels. That's again been very clearly shown. It's not just about, a lot of the time you hear just eat less carbs or just eat less sugar. It really isn't that simple. Vegans have the lowest rate of diabetes of any group, and they almost exclusively get their energy from sugars. So it's not just about the sugars, it's about the microbiome, how they digest those sugars, and how we interact with our biochemistry. And the microbiome really does affect our mental health every day. It's something that you've got to manage every day, unfortunately, but the plus side is you can manage it every day. So it is something that you can make gradual changes over that will hopefully produce resilience, and will then allow you to eliminate that stressor, if you like. There will always be the stresses of life, but if we can eliminate the stress caused by our digestion, then everybody's going to find it much easier to cope. So that's just a very quick summary of where we are. Like I said, we have very in-depth detail for all the various aspects of that if there's any questions that you'd like to get more information on. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Malcolm. And that was great. I had some lots of questions come through. Again, just a reminder to everyone watching, please use the Q&A function for any questions for both Patricia and for Malcolm. I might kick one off myself, Malcolm. Something I read, the microbiome is quite a recent medical and scientific discovery, isn't it?
It's not a recent discovery, but it's definitely recent that we're starting to understand just how important it is. So the fact that we had bacteria in our guts and on our bodies, all surfaces of our bodies, has been known for a long, long time. But we've always, until very recently, we've always regarded that as a risk rather than a benefit. So, that's why there's a lot of sort of disinfectants and antiseptics and all of those kind of things. And actually there's a lot of evidence now that causes us problems. So we've got a lot of data that you don't actually want to disinfect unless you're in very specific circumstances. So, if you've touched a surface that has a pathogen, yes, you want to disinfect, but you don't want to disinfect all the time, because what you're doing is actually destroying the beneficial bacteria. And the beneficial bacteria will help you control the bad bacteria. So the concept of the microbiome being something we want to help and look after, and that can help and look after us, is quite new. But the idea that the bacteria are around has been around for a very, very long time.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Malcolm. And Patricia, maybe one for you. I mean, when you're talking to your patients and the people you work with, I mean, what does good gut health look like? What do you recommend?
Well, that's a really long. How long's a piece of string? It depends on the individual, obviously, but good gut health, I guess, in a nutshell, would be that your digestion is working well, bowel function's working well, that the person just doesn't feel unwell, basically. Yeah, I mean, it could be, if they've got an inflammatory gut condition, you obviously want to settle that. I mean, it's quite a big question to encapsulate down, but yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, I suppose within the wider context of overall health, you see it as it's a critical.
Oh, look, there's no question. Good gut health is the absolute linchpin of good health and well-being. And I work as a health and lifestyle consultant, and the well-being is the thing you're wanting people to have, that level of good health and well-being. So good gut health. I suspect that most people in this day and age are not walking around with good gut health. I think it's it's becoming very obvious, as Malcolm was saying, that the research is indicating that it's far more important and far more linked to mental health and well-being.
Thank you. A question from the group. You mentioned comfort food with high sugar that can impact serotonin levels in the body, making us feel good and comfortable. Are there any types of food where we can identify such a clear link between food and mood?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's broken up into sort of two aspects, if you like, from my point of view. And Patricia, I'll get her to give her view once I've given mine. Is so you've got foods that make you feel good that aren't good for you, and then you've got foods that actually improve your general feelings of well-being and are good for you. And so the high-fat, high-sugar ones, they're the obvious ones. So yes, they definitely do make you feel good. And Patricia's right about how complicated it is. So every one of our microbiomes is going to be a little bit different, and so everyone will react differently to different foods. But in general, the ones that make you feel good for the wrong reason are the high-fat and high-sugar ones. The ones that make you feel good for the right reasons are things like prebiotics and these complex, whole, fiber dense type foods, because what they do is, first of all, they suppress those other bacteria. So the bacteria that try and hijack your system are actually destroyed by the good bacteria. But also they start to just regenerate the pools of serotonin, the good bacteria, I should say. So the bad bacteria that feed off the sugar and the fat, they do very short bursts, which is why you get sugar crashes and things like that. Talking about the feedback loop is very quick with those types of foods. But with the prebiotics and sort of the whole micronutrient foods, they won't give you that kind of instant feel good, because they're not spiking the serotonin. What they'll do is slowly increase the pool of serotonin and other neurotransmitters, so that your moods then starts to stabilize. So I'm not saying you shouldn't eat the fatty foods and the good foods that make you feel good. Don't get me wrong. There are other aspects to it other than this. But what you shouldn't do is rely on them, because when you're using these highly processed foods and these high fat foods, what will happen is, again, you will push the microbiome the wrong way, And that will then mean that the only way you get the fix is through the high fat foods and the sugary foods, because you don't have enough of the fiber digesting bacteria to then produce the serotonin in a general level. Hopefully that answers the question. Patricia, did you have anything you want to add?
Look, all I would add to that is fermented foods, been around for centuries, and they definitely are advantageous to take and have regularly in your diet. Definitely I really don't have any much more to add to that, to be honest. You've encapsulated it pretty well.
Tough act to follow on many levels, but another question through live here. Insulin resistance is a key to good gut well-being. The amounts of hidden sugars in most daily foods, i.e. breads, cereals as examples. What are your opinions or thoughts on intermittent fasting as an option?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So there's very good evidence that intermittent fasting does good. It's a little bit confused from the point of view that a lot of the studies that are done don't really properly measure the starting place of the people that do the intermittent fasting. So because they're just pulling everybody into the same groups, you get a little bit of confused results. But in terms of generally, intermittent fasting seems to work for a lot of people, so long as they don't suffer from things like hyperglycemia, where their blood sugar will just drop if they don't eat. Absolutely agree on the insulin sensitivity thing. It's 100% really important, both for mood and for just general blood sugar management, because the insulin sensitivity has actually been shown to affect the ability of neurotransmitters to bind to their receptors and things like that as well. So intermittent fasting, again, has been shown to be a way to improve insulin sensitivity. It's not the only way, though. So it's important to kind of keep the general underlying principle of what you need to do is have a good nutritional system. So intermittent fasting works well if the bit that you're not fasting in has everything that you need. It's not so good if all you do is not eat for 12 hours and then eat the same rubbish that you were going to eat in the 12 hours that you didn't eat, although there is some evidence that just fasting has an effect. Interestingly, one of the things about intermittent fasting is people their microbiome tends to degrade over time because they don't feed the microbiome properly. So if you've got things like a prebiotic that doesn't have any energy in it, usable energy in it for us that you can take, and we've actually done a little bit of work on this with MediKane, is that we've shown that if you take MediKane on top of intermittent fasting, you actually get better results than if you just have intermittent fasting alone, because all you're doing is feeding the microbiome. You're not getting those blood sugar levels up, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks. That was response, Malcolm. Having read a lot about these tech CEOs who are all intermittent fast during the day, they say it helps increase their concentration.
Yeah, there's some interesting work on the fact that it does increase clarity, and that's probably also because it reduces inflammation. So you've also got to remember that inflammation is basically the cause of a lot of these problems. And so anything that reduces inflammation will give you a better result. And intermittent fasting does seem to do that. Interestingly, there's a bunch of work that I've been working on with some colleagues about actual long-term fasting and resetting the immune system and the inflammatory system altogether. And there's some evidence, it's still quite early stages, that if you basically fast for 4 days, if you can manage it, your immune system goes hard reset. And it's actually being used in some trials as a means to more effectively manage chemotherapy and things like that, because what you want to do with chemotherapy is reduce any other source of inflammation, so that when the chemotherapy is used, what it does is specifically target the tumor cells. And there's some preliminary evidence on that. So it's a really exciting field. I'm just not sure that we've really sorted all the complexities out yet.
Thanks, Malcolm. Patricia, question here for you. Does inflammation cause a leaky gut?
I think there's no question about that. I would absolutely support that, 101%. Yeah. And my experience over the last 30, 40 years of working with people is that low-grade inflammation generally across the system is sitting there. It's underneath so many chronic diseases. And all I can say around that, the whole thing with MediKane, is the one thing, the one constant that I've observed across in fact, it's what's really impressed me with the product so much, is that it seems to address a myriad of different conditions, but I think the key thing is that it's lowering the levels of inflammation in the body, and that's where we start to see so many different conditions that in some respects you would think are not connected, but it's that underlying inflammation that seems to be the key factor that we start to see results, and quite rapidly in many cases. So yes, that's my answer.
Thank you, Patricia. Probably one for Malcolm here. Diabetes Australia, it's Diabetes Week. What's Diabetes Australia's position on gut health and its link to overall good health for people living with diabetes?
Yeah, it's definitely an area that there is an emerging area for them. So I think again, I mean, one of the things you've got to understand is that what we're basically talking about is dietary management here. So dietary management is universally accepted as the most comprehensive tool for managing blood sugar levels, not just with people living with diabetes, but there are other things that have uncontrolled blood sugar levels, and dietary management is the way to do it. So dietary management is microbiome management. You can't separate the two. It's just not possible. So they're starting to explicitly talk about it now, but they've really been doing it for 15 years. I mean, if you look at any clinical trial that's been done, dietary management always is effective to some degree. Often it's more effective than the pharmaceuticals, and certainly the two together are much more effective than anything alone. So yeah, the position statement may not use the word microbiome. It probably does now. I mean, I can say in my personal interactions with people from the ADEA and things like that, their comments to me are, yeah, of course, everybody knows that the microbiome is really important. Whether they put the word microbiome in their official documentation or not, honestly, I haven't looked at their official documentation for a while, but I do know that, yeah, like I said, if you're talking about dietary management, you're talking about microbiome modification. So
that's great. Thanks, Malcolm. And Patricia, anything to add there on specifically around diabetes management? Or?
Sorry, I just didn't catch that last one.
Just say again. Anything further to add there to diabetes management and the specific role of diet or your experiences?
Basically, definitely raising your level of fibre, good fibre in the system, prebiotics, and I've actually had both personally and with my clients, had very good results with adding fermented products. It's an area that I'm really quite interested in, and that's something I'd add. I mean, Malcolm's covered it very effectively, but yeah.
So I suppose, thanks. We've probably got time for 2 more questions here. So one here, prebiotics, following on from what you said there, prebiotics help feed the microbiome. Are all prebiotics the same? Who'd like to take that?
Absolutely not. And this is one of the... You're about to say the same thing, Patricia?
Yeah, go for it, Malcolm.
And this is actually a big problem with the industry at the moment, and it's something that we're actively trying to change at the moment. So myself and a bunch of people, including Patricia and others that I've worked with, we're really trying to get this idea that all you've got to do is say the word and suddenly you've fixed the problem. So the microbes in the gut are what we call conditional pathogens. And what that means is that there's almost no absolutely bad and no absolutely good bacteria in the gut. Given the right circumstance, almost all of them can be good and almost all of them can be bad. Even the really nasties like, Clostridium and stuff that most people have heard of. If you don't have any in your gut, you're actually worse off than if you have a tiny amount of them in your gut. And different bacteria are fed by different things. And so what you need to do is make sure that you're really feeding all of the bacteria in your gut that are positive and not feeding the ones that are negative so you don't get an imbalance. So it's really that imbalance. And then we did a really interesting experiment where we actually fed a very basic prebiotic, psyllium husk in this case, to individuals and animals. And after a certain period, they started to get sick. Because even though technically it was feeding what's supposed to be a good bacteria, what was happening was that one type of bacteria was the only thing being fed. And so it started to take over and it started to make things bad. And so what you want, one more point is there's very little evidence that any one bacteria controls a scene. But what is universally true is the more diverse your microbiome, the healthier you are. There has not been a single study ever done to my knowledge, and I've looked at literally hundreds of them, if not thousands, where the person that was the healthiest had the least diverse microbiome. And so what you want is a prebiotic that increases or at least maintains the diversity of the microbiome. And that's something, again, that we specifically looked at and specifically targeted with MediKane. That's why we have different ingredients, because no one ingredient will feed the entire microbiome. So if anybody tells you we've got the magic prebiotic, it's marketing, it's not science. We've got a whole bunch of things that we give to people and it makes them healthier. It's not a magic bullet, it's a complex system that you need to manage.
Great, thanks, Malcolm. Kind of final question. It was more of a comment, but maybe we just, said during the presentation, they feed an emotional response. And I suppose here what we're talking about is a good gut health feeding an emotional response and that general feeling of well-being. Malcolm, any kind of final thoughts on or statements you'd like to make about the overall way that, diet can help make you feel better?
Yeah, speaking personally, I mean, we've got clinical data on this as well, but just as speaking personally, I test everything on myself. So all of the products that I develop, I test, and I can tell the difference. And it's a message that I get fed back as well. And I'll let Patricia talk about this because she has much more contact than I do. But when I try a new product, I have to stop taking MediKane for 4 or 5 days so that they don't overlap. And by day 4 and 5, I can tell I'm not taking my MediKane anymore. I should say that I used to suffer from hypoglycemia. I used to have it very badly. In with that, if I didn't eat regularly, my blood sugar would drop. It would affect my mood. To the point where people used to say to me, "Malcolm, you have to eat right now." Because my mood would change that significantly. And that has not happened since I started taking MediKane, unless I go off it so that I can try my next product. So that's just me personally. And like I said, there's a lot of clinical data, but Patricia, I mean, you've got a lot more experience with this than I have.
Absolutely. It's why I'm so passionate about the product. I just get so much feedback from people taking the product, the mood swings settle, sleep patterns settle, brain fog lifts, clarity improves. They just feel better, amongst a myriad of other things. And of course, if they and I have quite a few clients these days that if they run out of their product, they're on the phone and, you know, where's my product? I'm desperate for my product. Can you get it to me? It's really interesting. They won't travel without taking it with them. They just want to make sure they've always got it with them, and they just say, I feel better when I'm taking it. So, you know, that to me, that speaks volumes. And when you have that repeat request for a product like that, it tells me that, and I see so many different conditions that just resolve, settle, get the body balanced, get their blood glucose balanced. They just feel better. There's no question about it. So yeah, I see it on a regular basis and hear it every day from my clients.
Well, thank you for that, Patricia, and good to know for everyone that we've got a human guinea pig in Dr. Malcolm Ball. Who's
so I trust a scientist that doesn't test their products on themselves.
And I take it as well.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for your question. I know we haven't got through all of them, and Malcolm and Patricia and I will follow up with each individual afterwards. So thank you with that. But before we go, I just wanted to share a really important activity that's going on tonight. It's the Heads Together, Australia's biggest online conversation about diabetes and stigma, where hosted by Diabetes Australia. It's this evening at 7 o'clock. If you've got the appetite for another online event, you can register at the address there below. And finally, yeah, we're crowdfunding at the moment. There's just under 2 weeks left of our campaign. Thank you to everyone who's invested and joined us already. And I know there was a few people here today that have. If you'd like any more information on why we're crowdfunding and the investment offer, then please visit the page there on Virtual. And finally, yeah, thank you everyone for joining. We'll get the recording out. Thank you, Patricia.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.